My name is Walker McKusick, and I'm the National Director of VoteSmart. VoteSmart is a national organization dedicated to providing free, factual, and unbiased information on candidates and elected officials to all Americans. And we're very excited to be here at the Summit on Civility. We believe that factual information provides a common ground for us all to have these conversations that are so needed in our country. We're also very happy to be based at Drake University and very glad to be here today. I want to introduce everyone else up on this panel before we get into our questions on civility and the upcoming election cycle, which I'm sure you're all dying to hear about. First up, we have Noor Naseer, immediately to my left. Noor leads innovative strategy development at Centro on the media innovations and technology team. She helps clients build smarter, multi-screen campaigns through consideration for emerging offerings available across the digital media landscape, including opportunities for advanced video, mobile, and data. Previously, Noor took on planning and digital activation responsibilities at Starcom MediaVest Group. Centro is a provider of enterprise-class software for digital advertising organizations. It boosts media team and business performance by enabling advertisers to plan, buy, and analyze real-time bidding, direct search, and social campaigns in one single platform. Its headquarters are in Chicago, and it has 40 offices in North America. Centro has received numerous accolades for its commitment to employees and workplace culture. Next up is Travis N. Ridout. Travis is the Thomas S. Foley Distinguished Professor of Government and Public Policy in the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs at Washington State University. Very glad that you came all the way out to join us. He is one of the country's leading authorities on the topic of political advertising and serves as a co-director of the Wesleyan Media Project, which studies and tracks political advertising. From 2014 to 2016, he served as the chair of the Political Communications section of the American Political Science Association. Travis received his PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2003, and his research on political campaigns, political advertising, and campaign finance has appeared in various journals. Travis's most recent book, Political Advertising in the United States, was published in 2016. Finally, on the end, we have Dave Price. Dave is WHO TV's political director, hosts the Sunday morning show The Insiders, and anchors Channel 13 News on weekend evening. It's difficult to find a local television reporter in the United States who has spent more time covering presidential candidates than Dave. Dave grew up in Belleville, Illinois, where he formed his passion in politics. He graduated from Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville and later worked at the powerhouse radio station in St. Louis, KMOX. Dave left St. Louis Radio to earn his master's degree at the prestigious University of Missouri-Columbia. In 2001, Dave began his career at WHO TV, where he specializes in coverage of the Iowa caucuses and state government. Dave has earned a National Emmy, Edward R. Murrow, and dozens of state and regional awards for his reporting and anchor. He has also authored his first book, Caucus Chaos, an insider's account of the always unpredictable way Iowans help pick the next president. He lives in Clive with his wife, Emily, and son, Hayden. Everyone, please join us in welcoming our panel. So Travis, I wanted to start with you. How do we define civility besides knowing it when we see it? And how does it differ from polarization, another topic we hear a lot about these days?
Right. So different people define civility in different ways. Some people focus more on just the show of respect that you're giving to someone else. Other people kind of focus on the content of the message itself. So are you using insults or swear words, think profanities, things like that. Others focus more on whether you're violating norms, which I think is an interesting way to focus on civility, in that it suggests that what is civil and what is uncivil can change over time as our norms in society change over time. The second part of your question, what is polarization? Polarization has to do more with what we think. And political scientists divide this into two types of polarization. There's kind of issue polarization, so our positions on issues, and we're becoming more polarized in that there are more people, moving to the left, and at the same time there are more people moving to the right. Another form of polarization is affective polarization, really our emotional responses to the political parties. And it used to be the case that we liked our own political party and we were indifferent toward the other political party. Now it's the case we generally still like our own political party, but we hate the other political party. There are some, maybe you've seen this Pew survey, about 60% of us say we would be unhappy if our child married someone who was of the other political party. That's affective polarization, and it's been increasing over the past 20, 30 years.
And obviously incivility is something that not only we stumble into and doesn't just come up in conversation, but something that can be used as well. Noor, how do you see political campaigns using incivility?
I don't know how political campaigns aren't using incivility, right? And they have been for quite some time. I think the most noted one that everybody in this room can think of is just TV smear campaigns, right? Where you showcase the other candidate and it's black and white and grainy and they're an evil person who wants to take away from your family, and then suddenly it cuts to color and it's this wonderful other candidate that wants good for you and you should vote for them. And I think that's a classic use of it. Maybe it's to be questioned whether or not that's defined as incivility, but I'm going to say that's the softer side of it. And now we've graduated into a world where we've gone far beyond that type of smear campaign or that kind of negative tactic, and we're doing things that are much more aggressive because people aren't just turning off their TVs if they're not interested in seeing smear campaigns. They ultimately are going to be on the internet and they're not turning that off. So the opportunities to reach people with messages in the digital video space, in social media, are quite plentiful, and political campaigns are really taking advantage of that.
Absolutely. So, Dave, you've seen a few political campaigns in your day.
A couple.
Yeah. What are some historical trends in campaign civility or polarization, whether it be over an entire campaign you've seen or just day to day on the trail?
I'm going to talk, let's just talk about this one that we're in right now, which, and this one started by the last one. It's just continuing through here. But to Noor's point about, of course, that's the most obvious thing that we probably think of are those campaign commercials that my company and others make a fortune on. It annoys everybody, but they clearly work and they run all the time, and people call our station and complain about it. But when you portray the other side as the devil, it motivates people. So that happens nonstop. I don't know that I can give a timeline of when we hit this point, but I would have to blame social media for part of this. So if we go back to maybe the '08 cycle, which is probably a little more prevalent back then, where you're really seeing campaigns have their own websites, and maybe back then it was blogs. Everybody's on social media one way or the other. And that so many of these social media posts, perhaps you've researched this, but play into that. It's almost like the TV ads you're talking about, but this is numerous times a day in a short burst, meant to incite in some way some kind of passion in you, hatred of the other side, demonizing the other side, your side walks on water, whatever it is. And that toxic atmosphere right now, I don't think has really gone away. So normally I would say probably as we're sitting here and, if we're thinking about the caucuses that'll be here in February, normally if we were talking maybe in September, I would say a lot of the ads that we're seeing on TV are more the biographical things, perhaps, hey, this is Travis. He's a great guy running for president. Look at him. He cured cancer. He loves puppies. He's great, right? All of those things true. But the social media component of this is so different right now because that's so frequently the nasty, the incivil part of all of this. So to me, that's the bigger change. And that's just a constant motivational force that's out there that kind of entrenches people in those sides that you were talking about and hardens those polarized sects. sects.
Besides puppies, Travis, have you studied or noticed any of the things that Dave was talking about in your observations of historical trends around campaign incivility?
Yeah, we've got studies of political advertising going back to about the 1960 presidential campaign, and there's definitely been a marked increase in negativity in those ads. I guess the good news, if there is any, is that it seemed to peak in 2010 if we're looking at congressional races, and it stayed at that steady, very high level of negativity since 2010. It's hard to measure incivility over time because we don't have these, 100-year-long time series. But I know there was a research study that just looked at letters to the editor that were printed in newspapers going back, I forget, maybe 100 years. And it really did notice an uptick in recent years in the incidences of incivility there.
So this cycle so far, the FEC reports that over $400 million have been raised by presidential candidates for the 2020 election. So Travis, to kind of go on that theme a little bit more, what does the current landscape of political campaign advertising look like, especially any uncivil advertising you've noticed?
Right. So far this cycle, we haven't seen too much negativity, too much incivility. I think 80%, well, let me step back. I did a quick analysis of some social media advertising, so paid ads on Facebook, and about 80% of them up to this point have been positive. So that seems, fairly high. Where they're not being positive, it's Democrats saying nasty things about Donald Trump. Donald Trump has, one of his new people to pick on in his ads is Elizabeth Warren, along with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. And so that's where you're seeing it. They're trying to raise money off of, getting you to respond emotionally to Donald Trump or Elizabeth Warren.
Dave, what have you seen in covering all this?
I think, and I may have skipped ahead with my last answer a little bit, but I'm going to separate a little bit between the ads you talk about and the posts, I think, are maybe slightly different. So to me, anecdotally, not empirically, the posts would be the ones for me that would stress civility or test civility more often. Those ads still primarily feel positive that we're fairly early in the cycle, and that'll probably change here as the pressure increases, but I see a difference in the posts that aren't ads. I guess you could argue everything's an ad, right? But in the activists and campaign posts, those seem especially negative.
So we've got paid advertising on various platforms. We have more organic posts, perhaps. Nor, regardless of the medium of this incivility, who benefits from it or polarization, and how do they benefit?
So the byproduct of just incivility benefits a lot of different parties, and I don't know that they would always necessarily want to agree that they are the beneficiaries. But that would include political candidates that are running. That would include advertisers, whether or not they want to admit that they are the beneficiaries, they do as well. And then the political parties themselves are also beneficiaries. And these are just a couple of the groups that are, and media organizations is another one. And by media organizations, I mean including news outlets, amongst many other parties. So as far as saying that they are all benefiting from it, I think there are some things that are really obvious about how political candidates are benefiting from it, and We've already heard from our panelists about why it can be so motivating. Anger and fear are really strong motivators for people to take action, and that's something that politicians have capitalized on for a very long time. How often have you been so sad that you've driven yourself to vote? It's not sadness, it's not surprise, it's fear and it's anger that really drives people to take action, and that just isn't getting old. That is still in style. So I won't delve deeper into the pretty obvious reasons why it's beneficial for them, but I also mentioned the media, and I also mentioned advertisers. And for the media, you might think that they, of course, don't want there to be incivility. They want civil discourse, and we've been talking about that for much of today. The thing that the media always needs is they need advertisers to support them, and they're not only going to get those advertisers to support them if a lot of people are visiting their content. And when you want people to visit your content, they need to sort through all the other content out there and decide that they are so emotionally connected to what you have to offer that they are going to prioritize what you are bringing to the table over all the other things out there. Does anybody know, on average, how many ads you're exposed to in a day? Like, could you guess? I was thinking like 50 and 100.
Yeah.
So I saw from a white paper and an infographic that was released by the University of Southern California on psychology and advertising that they say you are exposed to an average, not every day, but on average on any given day, you're exposed up to 5,000 advertising messages. I'm like, when does that even happen? But that's actually an important point to make, is that you don't even realize that you're being exposed to with such incredible regularity. So that's where there's a lot of pressure, especially in the political field and for media organizations, to say, you're getting exposed to so much and you have blinders on, you're not seeing it, you don't have an awareness of it, so we need to cut through. And incivility that drives that anger-based response, that fear-based response, can be a really good way to get you. And then advertisers, I mentioned them as well, what they want is to make sure that they're collecting data on what you do across the internet. So when do you engage most likely? Do you engage to say, this was such a wonderful article, thank you so much? Unlikely. You're more likely to be a troll who loves to get on the internet and talk, express your emotions essentially in so many words. And that can be a strong means of gathering data, of understanding how people want to engage, how often they want to engage, and what they're most affected by. So that's something that's important for all of these different groups.
Absolutely. Travis or Dave, do you all have any thoughts on the beneficiaries, the benefits of incivility across campaigns as well?
I think this isn't necessarily a good thing or anywhere close to a good thing. But if you are a politician who engages in incivility, you will frequently provide the quote which provides the headline to get you to click on a link. So let's use immigration for a topic. Let's say if a Democrat disagrees with President Trump's policies on separating parents and children apprehended at the border, if the headline is Senator Price disagrees with President's immigration plan, versus option 2, which was his quote, Senator Price says, President Trump, you are a racist. Maybe that's not an incivil enough example. But the more explosive your quote, your behavior is, and obviously President Trump is a good example of this, and his behavior in the 2016 cycle garnered him so much more coverage than the other Republican field, right? Even as a group, I'm going to go out on a limb and say most people here are far smarter than the average bear. It would probably take us a moment or two to recall all of the Republicans who ran in 2016. And there's a reason for that. A, they lost, but B, they didn't get anywhere near the coverage that the president did. And as you know, when you collectively go back and look at what happened, you had the incivil candidate most of the time saying these outlandish things, and that became the news driver of the day, which dominated most of the coverage. So then the follow-up questions to Jeb Bush would be, instead of Governor, what do you think about taxes or whatever it was, is Governor, what do you think about what Donald Trump said about your wife? Right? I mean, that's what a lot of the coverage was. And so that has continued throughout. And I'm not going to monopolize the time here, so I can come to this later, but I brought a Facebook example of this battle of civility that we can bring up here later, but to me underscored what we are experiencing every day.
Absolutely.
We call that a tease in TV.
I was just going to say,
get you to stay tuned.
Good tease, Dave. So let's turn then to social media, the posts that we talk about that aren't necessarily paid or boosted, but just that are put out there. Noor, what do you see the role being of social media in fostering incivility, especially among young people, the demographic where there seems to be most activity?
Social media has been the one thing that has fundamentally changed what it means to interact with media. Who's the media? What's mass media? What are journalists? Are you a journalist? Right? Like, I mean, everybody is and nobody is at the same time. So once upon a time, if you wanted to have a voice, the platform was you becoming a part of a credible institution that delivers news, right? The Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, whatever, your local paper, and or the local news outlet. And in today's world, if I have the following that I've cultivated in a social space and you come to listen to what I have to say, then the credibility is implied because you're open to hearing it. And that's really a part of the world that we live in today, right? Where if I say I'm a political commentator, who's here to certify that I'm not, right? I can just say it, and there's this belief in fake it until you make it. If many people are following me, then next thing you know, people are starting to turn on to me, and credible news outlets start turning to me. I mean, it happens. It happens all the time. And social media has really fostered that type of opportunity. And in some cases, I would say there's legitimacy. But there are many instances where I'm not going to name names besides Alex Jones, as far as people who, what is their background in journalism? What is their background in double checking sources and making sure that those sources are credible? There just seems to be no responsibility in an age of social media. And I know in the keynote at the top of today, that there was mention of some of these bodies, like the Facebooks, the Twitters of the world, they're doing a little bit to change those things, but they are definitely not doing enough. And that's a big reason why social media is really continuing to foster so much incivility.
Dave, speaking of social media, I heard you've got something to show us by chance.
I probably built this up far too more. Just as some context, so I'm a TV reporter in Des Moines, the NBC station. We're not cable, we're not opinionated, so our thing is we have to be as nonpartisan as possible, right? So I'm not going to go on some pro-Republican rant, pro-Democratic rant, whatever. So because of that, I probably overanalyze what I put on social media to a fault. And I'm not, so I posted something on Monday, and you can all determine, as the viewers did, about whether it was correct or incorrect to do this. So this was coming after we have Hurricane Dorian building. This is before the Sharpie episode with the president, if you followed that. So the president in one of the briefings had talked about that he had never even heard of a Category 5. And that's what Dorian was going to be, a Category 5. If you know your hurricanes, that's as bad as it gets, right? This would be the 5th named hurricane that has hit since the president has become president. So it was a little odd that he would say he's never heard of these things before. NBC put a clip together that had either 4 or 5 snippets of the president talking about hurricane Category 5s. And just to resell this pitch, this week he said he's never heard of one. So it was a little odd. So I did a little post about it and just said, I put his quote down and, I write that this was the 5th time this has happened since he's been president. I'm having a hard time figuring out what this is. So what do you think about this? Does it bother you? Do you not even care? And then the avalanche of comments came in. So there were like 200 comments right away, which I would like to tell you that every thoughtful post I put on there gets 200 comments instantly, but that is not the case. So, and most of them were probably anti-president. If you wanted to do an analysis going through point by point of what is civil and what is not, probably 3/4 of these things would not fall into the civil category. So most of them are going off about the president, like this one woman, Susan, had said, his stupidity affects other stupid people who believe him. That's probably not a model of civility, right? There were others who expressed concerns that he has some kind of mental defect, that he lies all the time, does he even know what he's doing? I mean, there's a ton of stuff about that, right? There was nothing essentially saying, there was one post, I think, that said, I don't really care what he's talking about. The most important thing are the people. We got to make sure we get all the aid to them. So that would be a very civil one. Then I had a strand of about 4 or 5 people who took this as an opportunity to point out my liberal bias in very specific ways, as they say. The one guy said that I am not a patriot. So I had a lengthy discussion that ended with him calling me a putz. Which I haven't actually been called a while, so apparently that's still in the vernacular. And I'm not I don't want to belabor this, but there was another one who I went back and forth with, and sometimes to the amusement of my colleagues, I do engage with the trolls, because I do feel like every once in a while you do have a moment where you break through. It probably isn't more than 5% of the time, but sometimes it makes me feel like I can sleep better at night hoping that I fought the good fight. And obviously, I do my best to recognize whatever bias I have, but some of these conversations will make me think about certain phrasings I use or whatever. But this one guy and I went back and forth, and he's been on there before to come after us because we're all liberal and we're all whatever. And so he brought up that we didn't make a big deal when President Obama said, if you remember the one time where he said there are 57, he said, I visited all 57 states or whatever it was. And I had said, Andy, I'm not sure these two situations equate. I said, perhaps in my mind, the way a more equitable comparison would be when the president was talking about the mass shootings in Toledo instead of Dayton, where they really happened. At my place, we didn't do anything. It wasn't even a story because I think at least to us, it was just a simple misspeak, right? So 57 states, Toledo would seem to be the same kind of mistake that we all make. And look, people can disagree on this, but it just seemed weird to me that in this case, when we're talking about these category 5 things, it's just a weird thing if he's talked about it a bunch and then says he's never even heard of the thing. So that if you really want to dig into the weeds, feel free to go on the Facebook page and look at all this. But sorry for the long story, but this was a perfect real life example about social media. And almost every section that we've talked about in these first 10 minutes, this whole post reinforced that to me about the polarization, the one camp here, barely anybody who's kind of loose or just open-minded, the passion that comes out, the incivility that comes out, the blame the messenger that comes out, the name calling, and this was on both sides. So it all kind of wrapped it up. This whole topic kind of came in one post, I thought, for me.
So we've got some problems. But this conference we talked today, the summit, has not just been about trying to identify problems we may already know exist or are still unearthing, but about trying to hopefully find some guidance, some solutions that we can practice on the things that we do have some agency over. So let's maybe turn to that a little bit. Travis, as someone who observes media a lot, how does or should the news media cover incivility when it occurs in politics? For example, the contents of a tweet versus the contents of a sit-down interview versus a campaign advertisement.
Right, and that's hard, and I'm not a journalist, and I shouldn't necessarily tell journalists what they need to be doing because they really are in a bind, because the president says something, tweets something, it's automatically news, right? He's the president of the United States. On the other hand, is what he's saying politically consequential? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. If it's a fight with Rosie O'Donnell, let's say, what is the policy implication of that? Nothing, right? Is it news? Probably not, although it's kind of interesting, right? But in those situations, it seems like we need to step back and say, this really isn't news. This has no policy relevance at all. Let's ignore it.
Dave, how do you all approach that question in your own newsroom, or maybe how do you wish you did it instead?
It is the shiny object always, and it's difficult to not grab and focus your attention on the shiny object. I think every day we probably struggle with, I don't want to make this all about the president, but because he is just a different type of politician of that prominence that I know that I have ever covered before, it's difficult to not focus too much because we're not used to any previous president speaking in public this way. Perhaps if we go look at those unearthed Nixon tapes, I suppose there were some pretty incivil remarks, and I'm sure many of them perhaps have had that, or some of them, I guess. But we struggle with how much focus do you do on a tweet and name calling, and probably, I don't like to generalize because I always feel like I get defensive when people say the media do, but probably a criticism overall would be that we focus too much on insignificant tweets that he says, and there probably wouldn't, many times there aren't much implications on policy. Having said that, sometimes there are. Since we're sitting in Iowa here, I always have frequently envisioned our former governor here, Terry Branstad, who is President Trump's ambassador to China. And because of the time change, I can only imagine, and Ambassador Branstad goes back three decades with the leader of China. They knew each other years and years ago when he came out here. And I can only imagine what it's like to work all day on figuring out this trade deal and all these other complicated, intricate international relations. And then Ambassador Branstad has a glass of wine and goes to bed. And then President Trump picks up his phone and tweets some new policy. I mean, in that case, the tweet is probably pretty newsworthy. And especially if he's called President Xi something. I don't know if he's had a lot of names for him, I don't think. But, that's then to your point, then it is significant, right? But if it's another shot at the squad or Nancy Pelosi or whatever, then it's one of a million. But it's hard to not take the bait.
So thinking about some other advice, Noor, I'm curious what you think some responsibilities are that communications professionals have with regards to responsibility or political content.
So the reason why in my introduction there was that long read on the various nuances of me working for an ad tech company is that my perspective very much comes from the thoughts of how do you build revenue? How do you make sure that when you work in the media business, you have the lights on and you have the lights on for a long time? So I'm always thinking about revenue, and I think everybody in this room that reads a newspaper and knows anything about journalism knows that there's really two main revenue models. There is a subscription-based model, which is harder and harder. It's continuously been hard to maintain. And then there's the advertising model, which is much easier to gain revenue stream through. And the thing is, if you want advertisers, you need to make sure that the leadership that you work with is on board to not just figuring out how to create civil content, but how do you make that civil content appetizing to your readership so that they're actually clicking on it. Because this is, we had talked previously, and I said that when people read news articles, if they get to the end and they don't know how to feel because there's so much nuance and there's so much gray space and it's so nebulous, then they'll say, what am I supposed to do now, right? Like, what's the call to action? How am I supposed to feel? You didn't tell me how to feel. And that's what people are looking to do now. In a world where people have these minuscule attention spans, they want to read as little as possible, and they want you to very quickly tell them via some sort of piece of content exactly how they should be taking away what you've shared with them. And that's one of the benefit, quote unquote, benefits associated with writing about the president's latest tweet. It may not be adding any new value to your understanding of what's happening from a policy perspective. It's very good from a monetization perspective, because now I can say, as an advertiser, those are all these new people we can put into a bucket of being right-leaning versus left-leaning. And now we can serve more ads to them, and now we can make more money, and so can that publication. So this is like the never-ending complication. If you, on the flip side, are trying to propose to your editor or your leadership board, we want to do more long-form, well-researched pieces that will take hours and hours to write, and then few people will read them. How does that sound? They're not going to be on your side. It's really tough. So another thing that absolutely needs to be considered is digital transformation. If you do create these long form, well-researched pieces that are considering all sides, then you also have to think about all these new audiences that need to consume that, and consume it probably in a more condensed and concise way, but still maintain that civility. So I think that's one of the big challenges that continues to exist out there for journalists and the media to solve.
Absolutely. Dave, what responsibilities do you feel or see in this space?
I think, I mean, every day we're in the position of deciding that balance. And so at the end of the day, I think you want to feel good about, you know, in my case, what I put on TV that day. To your point, of course, I need as many eyeballs watching because my bosses want me to, and that's how they're going to pay me and make money for themselves. So there is that struggle frequently. And when I mentioned that shiny object, that's what we go through, because the low-hanging fruit tends to be the most salacious sound bites for us, or in this day and age, the tweets. And that is the sexy headline on so many stories. And we have to decide what value, if any, that actually brings to the overall discussion. Going back to that Facebook post that I was talking about, in a previous section, they were talking about not letting people post anonymously, which I totally agree with. Having your name on there is very beneficial. However, in many cases, that doesn't matter. People still are not civil, even with their names on there. You know, this may be a factor of perhaps you're more willing to behave this way with somebody you don't know as opposed to somebody you do know. But the challenge for when we post our stories on our website or just social media interaction is you want that to foster that almost one-on-one communication, but allowing people that venue. I don't know what I do with these people who've posted on here who are just mean-spirited and ugly. I guess I could go through and delete every one of them, but I'm not sure that's my place.
Travis, what do you think?
Well, it's hard because I'd say a campaign professional strategist has a responsibility to the client. They get paid for helping someone get elected to office. They don't get paid to improve American democracy, unfortunately. But I think there are creative ways to get your message across without resorting to incivility. And one of my favorite TV ads still, political ads, comes from 1990. A guy by the name of Paul Wellstone, a political science professor, was running for the U.S. Senate from Minnesota. And he had a 2-minute long ad that was just funny. It had video of him going around the state trying to find his opponent. And it was lighthearted. The message got through that this opponent is nowhere to be found in the state of Minnesota. Yet it wasn't uncivil. There was no name calling in that ad. And so I think sometimes we can just use some creativity, still get our message across without having to resort to name calling.
So one of the things we promised in this panel this session was some predictions. So we'll turn to those. But speaking of creativity, as well as calls to action that you mentioned, Noor, I think one thing to note too, of course, these cycles we're talking about that are presidential every 4 years, and there's a lot of change every 4 years. And I know one thing we've noticed at VoteSmart is that there are other organizations out there using the digital space to find creative new ways in media to create calls to action. There's one organization we partner with called Action Button, who tries to supplement news articles by not necessarily suggesting what you should do as a result of reading that article, but tells you what your representatives thinks about that topic, allows you to email them or contact them in some way. So maybe it isn't all dire in the digital space. But Noor, I'm curious what you think. What predictions do you see for civility during the 2020 presidential election cycle moving forward?
First, I want to say that I cannot believe it's almost 2020. I feel like it was the 2016 election moments ago. As far as predictions, I did look up one stat to share as it relates to spend in the political arena. So in 2018, the volume of TV spend was at $2.52 billion from a TV perspective. And that is forecasted to incline into 2020 to, I think it's at 3.5 billion. So that's TV, that's standard TV, that's, broadcast television. But by comparison, in the digital video space, we're spending less. I think it was under $1 billion worth of spend in 2018, and that's expected to incline to about 1.6 billion. So the incline is a more than 100% growth in the digital video space by comparison to about 30% growth in the traditional TV space. So what that means is that without a doubt, we're going to see so much more of this engagement happen in digital spaces. And the reason why that's really relevant is that there is many more ways to capture data and understand how consumers are reacting when that interaction happens in digital spaces, right? Because the thing is, when you watch a TV ad, you're watching a TV, there's no keyboard for you to instantaneously interact. But if there's more digital video, now there's more room for me to share, to retweet that, to send it to somebody else, to say how I feel about that. So I think we are also going to see some reactions to what has happened in 2016. I think there is a desire and a hunger to pull back on some of the incivility, but there's still a lot to come, and it's very hard to predict exactly what that is going to look like. I do think, again, there was mention that there are various players out there that want to be civil, and I think what's at the core of civility is a desire to share knowledge and to actually educate people. That means not stuffing messages down your throat in a 30-second spot, not just telling people that the other person is evil and wanting terrible for you and they're malicious. So who's going to be a big player in that space and do it well is yet to be seen. But I would say that there are publishers I'm seeing right now, or media publications, that are really looking to step up and highlight that they're there to educate you and inform you in a way that is unbiased. And we really have to see if that's what they end up doing and how that also ultimately impacts the political cycle.
Travis, what about you from where you sit? What are your predictions for the cycle we got ahead of us?
I think it's going to be a nasty election cycle. I don't think the incentive structure hasn't fundamentally changed between 2016 and 2020. News organizations have looked back at their coverage, said, we're going to try to do better in 2020. That's hard to do. I don't think there's any incentive for Trump to suddenly change his campaign strategy for 2020. He wasn't expected to win, managed to pull out a narrow win by being what he was. All indications we will continue to see that. The Democratic candidates, some of them are saying, well, maybe people want something different now, but you know what? Beto O'Rourke wasn't doing so well in the polls. pulled out the F word last week and got a bunch of media coverage because of it, right? And so I don't think the incentives are any different in 2020. It's going to be nasty.
Dave, what's your crystal ball say?
And Beto O'Rourke is actually, their campaign is selling T-shirts with the F on there. So that's a full embrace of the F-bomb. So he may not be the model of civility going forward, which is a little, although he did some of that in the Senate campaign in Texas. I think he would drop an F-bomb here and there. That's what you were talking about, to me, would be one of the fascinating sort of subplots as we go into 2020 for me, as far as it seems nonsensical to think that President Trump, and he's going to be the overarching figure in so many of these races probably, unless something really changes. It seems just bizarre to think that he's going to change course, right? He is who he is. He, as a president, is the same person he was as a candidate. Doesn't behave any differently. So for the Democrats, one of us in this room who will speak later knows some of these presidential campaigns pretty intimately from the past, but I think you would agree with me that historically we have, when we're voting, we have an incumbent in there and he's up for re-election. If he wins, we essentially keep things the way they were, or the country decides we want a pretty dramatic change, right? The Democrats are probably not going to nominate somebody just like Trump, although he's an extreme example probably, but you're not going to nominate the same kind of person and then expect that person to win, I don't think. I would think where we've seen those over the past, the challenger is a different type, whatever it is, policy, message, delivery, whatever it is, right? So for me, watching these 100 Democrats running is what, not only policy-wise, where they have some enormous differences in the political spectrum, but what style will they embrace? You have some of them who are claiming, at least now, this desire for civility to talk differently, and I'm not going to behave this way. But once it's the one-on-one matchup, and you have President Trump belittling you, your mother, your dog, your neighbor, your daughter, whatever it is, because it's a matter of time before that happens, because that's his style. He's very aggressive that way. So are you going to resist all of that and take the high road? That would be, that's a challenge, right? On a human nature, that's hard to not respond in kind. And is that what do Democrats even want? Do they want a fighter like Trump who's going to be like a Beto F-bomb kind of guy? The polls would probably not show that perhaps he's the right example here, but who knows, right? So maybe he has some kind of explosion. So he's going to match Trump's behavior with something in kind. I'm not saying it's O'Rourke, but is that what the nominee is? Or are we going to have that true contrast where we're going to see incivil versus civil, and then the public is the arbiter?
Well, we're going to take some questions here and hope we have some answers. Before we do it, please let's thank our panelists for sharing their thoughts, their expertise with us this afternoon. If you do have a question, just raise your hand, and Kelly here will be able to help you out.
You brought up the low-hanging fruit, and you also mentioned the Alabama map with the Sharpie, and that kind of made me wonder, when they were talking about hurricane relief plans, and then Trump brought out the map with the Sharpie, and then every single article I read was Trump doesn't know, or Trump put a Sharpie on this map, whatever. So what is the strategy for sorting through kind of that nonsense and getting people to actually engage with the important information, like what is the hurricane relief plan, and letting that other stuff go to the side? Because I know that's a flashy story, but that's not what people really need to know. So what is the strategy?
I say two things with that. I would fundamentally, part of me wants to agree with you. In this case, I guess I would justify that it is newsworthy if the President of the United States picked up a black Sharpie and changed the NOAA forecast or whatever it was I totally know what you're saying. In the grand scheme of things, obviously the people's well-being would be paramount here. I totally agree. In this case, I would also argue that hopefully, in my mind, both things are newsworthy, that we need to focus on the relief efforts and the setup, the before storm efforts to protect and get these people out of there. But because this is such a I'm going to use unique situation where somebody could have intentionally altered a map to try to justify a previous comment that appears to be outdated, that while it may have at one point, there may have been some of the periphery part of the storm that was going to hit the southeastern part of Alabama, that would seem to be outdated. So that would be the danger of the President of the United States, who is still a chief communicator to millions of people through social media and more traditional media, expressing what is not the most updated information. I totally know what you're saying, but I guess in this specific case, I would say both things are newsworthy.
Maybe in a case then that's not this one, what would you say is a strategy when you're in the newsroom trying to figure out how to do coverage? How do you have those conversations to try to get at what you think isn't necessarily just what viewers want to see, but maybe what would be helpful in that role as the arbiter of information?
I would just tell you some of those conversations aren't very pleasant with colleagues because we have differing opinions on it. You know, if you're a producer putting a newscast together, one of these tweets is that's easy to tease. It's easy to set up for the newscast that he called someone whatever, rather than start with, tonight we're going to talk about policy. The second way would probably be for the better of all of us, but we just have to have more of those conversations. And unfortunately, frequently it feels like there's not that time to have those kind of discussions because everybody's they're doing their task at hand. And, newsrooms are not as big as we want them to be. Perfect world, we'd have some more staff fully committed to what you're talking about. So I don't want to minimize anything you're saying because what you're saying is totally right. Just on a day-to-day basis, those discussions aren't always happening. I may get fired for that, by the way. So thanks for that.
You can come back next year.
On what Dave said is that one thing that's an underlying assumption we're making is that everybody wants civility and they're committed to doing what it takes to make civility happen. That's what everybody here is assuming to some extent. So a part of the question that was asked was that we have to give, the people what they need to know about. But what if they don't want it, right? What if I want just the Alabama map thing because now I can have a quick chuckle or I can be upset about it and that's it. I'm not ready to commit myself to what that takes. So it's just something to bring into the equation as well.
And that's come up throughout the summit, I feel like, as responsibilities both as consumers as well as media professionals. But which one do we have agency over at what times? Yeah.
I'd like to thank the panel for the discussion. It's been very interesting. I think that you've all kind of mentioned that incivility seems to be an innate quality of political campaigning. It just has been since its inception. I wanted to find out, what do you all think as far as the level of apathy in our public and how that may be impacting the increased degrees of incivility that we see? Are we just more apathetic as a people and are really tuning out, and the only way that we can tune in is if it's more outrageous than the last time? And is that contributing to kind of decisions that you as professionals have to make in your workplace around what you choose to cover and what you don't?
Noor, you kind of touched on that a little bit just now and the responsibility of audiences and the way audiences contribute to that. What do you think?
Sure. So I would say from the perspective of an advertiser, when people take behaviors that are notable because there's some sense of polarization where I can bucket you more specifically, that is of value. That's something that can put you into a segment. So that's the advertising side. But the way that you even set everything up, I feel is 100% true. There's nothing untrue about what you said. People are apathetic. We have so many different messages that we can lean into. So if you're not bringing something that's pretty sensational to the table for me to react to, then it's going to be hard for me to decide to actually engage and be a part of discourse.
Travis, and some of what you've looked at over time, what do you see as it relates to apathy?
Yeah, well, by some measures, we're not apathetic at all. Our last midterm election, we had the highest turnout in about 80 years, almost 100 years, depending upon how you measure it. I think part of that stemmed from some of these very emotional messages that we were receiving from the campaigns, right? There's also seems to be a bifurcation in the public that stems from social media, because I like politics. Today is a wonderful time to live because I can get politics 24/7 and right in front of me on my phone, and isn't it wonderful? But it also means that people who aren't interested in politics have the ability to get ESPN all the time, and they don't have to engage in any politics either. So I don't know, maybe we have some citizens who are more active in politics than ever before, and others who are dropping out.
I'd like to point out that Travis clearly is not a reporter. You found it such a great time. Maybe you want to go cover 25 people running.
Obviously, there's some questions that have been raised regarding the caucuses, regarding the amount of technical questions that are going to be raised. Is the party including the media in analyzing this? Because it has to do with coverage to a certain degree, and the validity of the outcome. How is that process taking place, and is the media being included in that analysis?
Dave, what have you noticed as these?
Are you asking if the Iowa Democratic Party has reached out to the media to figure out how the virtual caucuses would work?
What I'm saying is that, yeah, to a certain degree, I think at this point, any technical input that would help enhance the validity of the outcome should include a conversation with media about it.
I have not really had any of those conversations.
Two things. One, after the 2016 election, in its review of the Iowa caucuses from 2016, the Iowa Democratic Party had a big, and they included Republicans as well, but they had a big conversation, and people in the media were part of that. They did bring in media people to talk about what they needed from caucus reporting, what they might consider credible. I think that the conversation has gone well beyond where we were in 2016 and talking about virtual caucuses. But that's the comment. So a quick question though. In my mind, when we talk about apathy that just came up, when incivility creeps in, a lot of times it's at the point that facts have failed. People get uncivil when they run out of factual arguments, and they resort to insults. But what we're seeing in a lot of political reporting is that even when we provide facts as media folks, people deliberately disbelieve those facts. They disbelieve facts from science, they disbelieve facts from the media, they disbelieve facts from academia. And so with that lack of credibility feeding into our efforts to inform the public about the elections, where does that leave us as far as civility is concerned? Anybody who
Yeah.
wants to s-
Man, that's deep.
that?
That's a deep one.
This
Travis?
is the kind of thing that keeps me
Thanks,
up.
Kathy.
Sure. Travis, in any of your work around the media and in politics, has any of that delved into the amount of factual information and how that impacts voters, how that impacts politics? I'm just curious.
Well, let me step back. And your larger point is absolutely right. It's not as though we go around and say we trust the news media nowadays to get it right. In fact, levels of trust in the news media are strikingly low, and that's probably not your fault, but everyone conflates every news media organization and what they see on Twitter is all the same thing, right? And so people are left confused. What's true, what's not? Where do I go? And so I feel sorry for citizens in many ways. I don't know. I'm not sure I'm answering your question.
No, it's a difficult one. I mean, we at Vote Smart talk about how when we first were started back in 1988, the problem we were solving in some ways was an under-information problem. You maybe couldn't find information in some areas on down-ballot candidates, state legislators. Now the problem, the fight we're fighting for facts is an over-information problem. There's a million different facts out there you can pick and choose, and sometimes they do fail. So what do you trust? How do you know what to trust? I don't know, Noor or Dave, do you have any thoughts on how to ensure that facts don't fail, or finding and presenting facts in a way that help them not to fail?
I definitely don't have an answer to that
Yeah.
question. I guess just an extension from a commentary perspective is that where facts fail, feelings prevail, right? That's where suddenly I don't need any more information from you. I already know what I feel on this, and I don't need to explore this any further. So I'm tired of the argument, and I'm just going to move forward. So I don't know what the answer is, but as far as maybe an interesting insight I have observed is that I talked about political commentary earlier, and I think political commentators are a subsect of a larger umbrella of the influencer, the existence of influencers in today's world. And those people, if we align or subscribe to their values, I don't need to know everything that person truly believes. I know I believe in what they represent. So when they tell me something, I am all in. So I can't break it down on this like super factual, tactical level, but I'm in with them. And therefore I feel comfortable just aligning myself with their values. So the reason why I bring that up is that this is somewhat of a new advent in the digital and social landscape that we now live in. I'd say many more people are aligning themselves with influencers today than they have in the past. And I think because it's in its infancy, it's something that's going to mature and change with time, and that we are going to see people changing their behaviors and maybe, again, turning back to knowing that facts are very important and you can't just be all in on feelings or just base your values on the values of others that you respect.
Dave, you're an influencer. How do you take that responsibility?
I think in defense of people, some of this technology is still fairly new in the grand scheme of things, and it's difficult for people in some cases to determine. I'm going to pick on my late father, which is just for an example here. My dad didn't get on the internet, but he went to a coffee shop and sat with these same old farts every day where they solved the problems of the world. Okay? There's a little insight into my dad. And I can recall my wife and I at the time were looking for a new house. So just remember that little part of this story. So anyway, my dad calls me and he says that this was when Barack Obama was president. And my dad was many things. Used to be a lifelong Democrat. He switched to Republican when Reagan won. And then he stuck. He was, I guess by today's standards, probably a moderate Republican. So one of these old farts at the coffee shop tells him that Barack Obama as president will give you $1,000 toward your new house. And I go, oh yeah, where'd that come from? Oh, Wally saw it on the internet. My dad was a heavy smoker, so that's my impersonation. And I go, man, Dad, you and Mom live in a house that's probably about $100,000. You ought to sell your house because you can get a lot nicer house, which that was a whole side conversation. But I'm not picking on my dad, but his friend saw some random post on the internet, and, you know, perhaps it was a reflection of another older person who wasn't familiar with social media much or whatever it was, but he took that because it was in its printed form, you know, much like the newspaper that he grew up with, that he would take as gospel, the newspaper. And because, you know, you talk about influencers, well, if you look at social media, I mean, we tend to believe if we're Facebook friends with you, that adds a whole extra layer of credibility, right? Because my aunt posted this and I love my aunt, then this must be true. And so with my dad's case, his little coffee group, because Wally had told him this thing about the president, then the president was giving away 80 grand to whoever wanted it to move to a new house. And it's tough to overcome that. And my dad told me this story like 3 times. And I kept saying, Dad, I promise you this is not true. And, you know, his friend had no way, because his friend read the thing, and I think that's what we're up against, that people are still new to a lot of this stuff, and they read it, and they think that it's probably true. Maybe it was your Facebook post, well, not you, because you're a credible man, but just a random person's Facebook post or whatever it is, you look at it, you see it in print, and you go, all right, well, it must be true, right? So we try to fight the good fight, like Kathy's talking about, by providing you with the facts. Hopefully, those of us who try to be as neutral, as partisan neutral as we can, you know, can kind of break through a little bit on that. But I mean, it's a high hurdle, and maybe it's going to take a while to overcome.
I think we have time for a few more questions. We have more?
So I work in a newsroom similar to Dave. And
She's my competition.
But my question is, oftentimes we're sent out on assignment to localize a national story. Maybe it's something President Trump said impacting Iowa farmers, whatever it may be. And our social media team says these political stories that we do here locally tend to just fall flat. They don't get the engagement numbers, the likes, the comments, except if it's something like abortion or gun control, which everybody seems to want to weigh in on. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to this and wanting to drive traffic to our website on stories that maybe aren't as sexy, or these, you know, certain topics that are really driving that traffic, you know, just a snippet of a quote can become something misleading on a fairly boring subject. But how, as journalists, can we create and craft compelling content that draws traffic? And if you guys have any anecdotes, examples, people that you look up to or you know, you follow, because I think a lot of us are just kind of like, where do we stand on this?
Absolutely. Noor, I'm curious to get a little bit of context from you too, thinking about any local advertising, especially as you look at that marketplace compared to some of the more national hot button issues. How does that work in your space?
So I don't know that I have an answer, but I think I can at least address the complexity that we're also dealing with from an advertising perspective. And it's that the story that incidentally Centro told for a very long time is that local news is trusted news. Everybody turns to their local station. That's where they want to go. It's premium. It's premium content. You're going to trust it. And the assumption was that that meant you're going to not only trust, but have interest in all the content, which, as you just mentioned, isn't necessarily the case. And the thing that we do in today's world, from an advertising perspective, is as opposed to going to specific news publications, assuming that we're going to capture, let's say, the Des Moines audience or any audience from a single locality, we want to make sure that they're already inclined to being interested in that topic. So if it's about some thing that's locally affecting people on a political level, we would rather not just force ourselves to reach them within the confines of that political or that publication or that news organization. We would rather find data to reach them all over the internet, just knowing that they have suggested that based on other behaviors they've taken. So that's one of the really hard things, is that people who go to a single publication may only go there for 2 or 3 reasons. Maybe they just want local sports coverage, and it's hard to force them to want to consume things they're just not interested in. So, long story short, I have no answer.
Yeah. I know there are groups out there doing research on various innovative formats for presenting the news, and even a BuzzFeed style list. 5 reasons the Des Moines City Council's new policy on X is going to, and you have the bulleted list. That could be one way to engage some type of audience. Give it a try.
Dave, as a practitioner, what advice would you give on Lauren's question?
I think one of the things we struggle with would be, both of our primary time we spend would be on TV, but we have different audiences across our different platforms. So as we get better and better at it, it's probably packaging it in different ways of what people are willing to consume in that individual form of media. The headline writing will be part of it, obviously, but I know that I would suspect that KCCI's leaderboard and WHO's leaderboard today could be similar in the sense that depending on what's happened news-wise today, the top clicks will be probably fairly similar. So if we had a double murder somewhere, that's going to be high. If we have a 3-legged goat who just pulled a kitten out of a fire, that's going to be pretty high. If I've done a 19-minute piece comparing the Democratic presidential candidates' positions on climate change, I'm going to guess that's not going to be a high driver on our page, and which can be very ego-deflating. But sometimes I guess I would argue you just have to eat your broccoli. The packaging of it is probably important, and we're going to have to become better and better as we have almost countless alternative media sources out there across so many different platforms, especially as people skew younger and feel more comfortable using those other platforms. But to your point, I mean, you can't be all things to all people. And our website would show, if we start busting in on it, I mean, they're not going to, I don't know the particulars of it, and KCCI's either, but how much time people spend there and how much they're willing to bounce around. But I would presume most people don't click on every single subject header that we have, so you just have to understand some people don't care about it.
I have a follow-up question for you, Dave. What responsibility is there on local news organizations to cover things that your readership simply doesn't have an interest in? And do you abbreviate that content because there isn't that interest? Because you said you have to eat your broccoli. Do you have to eat your broccoli?
Yes, and I like broccoli. I think sometimes you have to cover something because you think it's the right thing to do, even though it's not going to be the most clicked thing on there. A city council meeting, probably 90% of the time, if you truly went week after week after week, which almost nobody does anymore as staffs have been shrinking all over the place, there's always something going on there that's worthy of coverage, but it may not be as sexy. And it's the sex, especially on the TV side, it has to be, in someone's mind, pretty sexy for us to show up there, because we don't show up week after week in all these different communities, although it would be better if we did. So, yes, I think, it may not be the business model, I suppose, that makes the most sense, but I guess I would argue sometimes you just have to do things because you think it's right.
I think we have time for maybe one more question here, yeah.
I'm not going to ask my question, or it's time to go, but I'm going to make a clarification. Apathy is the absence of caring. But when we have people who stop listening because they have heard so much and so much and so much and so much, what we might be dealing with is saturation. Now, I think that the cure is a little different. On the one hand, we really do want people to care. On the other one, we're dealing with almost an exhaustion of emotional reserves. And emotional reserves do not get restored through medicine. You can't take a pill. And so depending on what it is that we're causing, it may very well be that the answer or the therapy needs to take a different form.
Well, I hope part of that therapy might have been this session. I'm glad you all attended and appreciate your time. Let's thank our panelists again one more time.
And our last session of the day is back downstairs in the main auditorium in 15 minutes.
You're really great.
Good to see you next day.
Yes, likewise.
Really,
That was
really
fun.
good to have. So good to have an advertiser.
And thanks for all you're doing.